All right. Well, all right. Welcome, Sociology 102 Contemporary Theory. Hello, everybody. My name is Fatmir Haskai. I will be your instructor for the semester. So, as you notice up here on the board is our B Courses site. It is up and it is live. So, please go to it and familiarize yourself with it. Everything that you need to know and will be expected to know is here. So all the readings are there, right? So they're right here, they're down here. On the syllabus form, if you need to find the actual readings, you just click over to modules, and that's where you will find corresponding modules to each week with the weekly readings. So no textbook required, you don't have to go out and buy anything. It's all there conveniently placed for you, okay? Now everything's in PDF form, just so you know. So if you need that transcribed for any reason, there's software out there to do that. Unfortunately, I didn't have the ability to do it myself, but it's there and it's all in PDF form, okay? So that's for the readings. Let's get down to some other business. Sections will begin next week, okay? So they'll begin on January 27th. Hopefully you've all been assigned a section, right? And your GSIs, whom you will meet soon enough. We have a great group of GSIs this semester, so you're all in very good hands. They're all experienced, so you should have absolutely no problem there. In terms of the class itself, let's break down what you all want to know here is how to get an A, right? So break down the requirements. There are going to be 2 in-person exams. Yes, in-person exams. So that means you're going to have to come to class, and there will be an exam question. And it'll be an essay question. And you will have to complete that essay question in class in the blue book. And there will be 2 of those during the course of the semester. You have then a section grade, which is 20%. Hello, Oscar. Took my class last semester. So you have section, which will be 20%. That'll be determined by your GSIs. So they will tell you what you're required to do for that. And then there will be a final at the end of the semester, which will be 20%. For some reason, this is saying 90 here. Okay, we're going to fix that. Let's see. The final is 30%, actually. I'll fix that later on. Okay. So assignments and grading. So that's really basically it. There's no paper in this class. So there you go. You have to take in-class exams, but there's no term paper. So you've been relieved of that onerous task. But you are required to take these in-person exams. The exams are scheduled on particular dates and times. Those are not really negotiable. If you have, if you're an athlete or something else is going on, you're gonna have to talk to your GSI about that. Okay, don't talk to me, talk to your GSI. Your GSI is your point person. If you've ever had a class with a GSI before, they are the people you should talk to. If you, for whatever reason, if you're missing something or you need some clarification, they're going to be the best person to talk to because they're going to know you best and you're going to be in also their section. So they should be the ones that you should contact first and foremost. Okay? All right. Well, that's basically it in terms of the technical nitty gritty of the class. Anyone have any questions about this so far? No? Not so bad, all right? For those of you worried about in-person exams, they're not so bad, right? Is it bad? It was fine, right? Oscar says. It's not so bad. So I know some of you might be nervous. Maybe you haven't had in-person exams yet. It's good because you get the pain over quick. It's like going to the dentist, except I'm not giving you Novocaine and you're not getting a toothbrush afterwards. But it's quick and it'll be over, and so I think it's a better way for everyone to go rather than dragging things out over time. All right, great. So I'm glad that we've gotten that out of the way. So let's jump right into the course then a little bit here. It's the first day of class, so we're not going to get too crazy here, but I think you should know what you're in for to one degree or another. So if you haven't taken theory, you must have, I assume. You've taken classical, perhaps. You should have. This is going to be a class on theory, and theory can be, theoretical, can be really abstract at times. But this is contemporary theory, and there is a richness to contemporary theory that we don't necessarily always have with classical theory because it's more recent. It's also much broader, right? There are a lot of different traditions, There are a lot of different questions that are being grappled with. And it's a kind of a whole kind of complex array of arguments and thoughts that are being worked out essentially in the intellectual sphere over time. So it also tends to get perhaps both a little more abstract on some levels than classical theory, if you can believe it or not, and at the same time more concrete because it's more recent. Abstract in the sense that it begins to really, we could say deconstruct is the word that we use in theory, but I'm going to use a different word. I'm going to use a word that is probably more common. It really begins to take apart, really, what we think of as knowledge, right? What we think of as the things that we know in society. It begins to really fundamentally question the basis and the foundations of society that, for the most part, usually go unquestioned, right? So when you're living your daily life, you're walking around, generally speaking, unless you're like a super profound person, or maybe you ate too many gummies, you're usually not questioning society, right? You're usually not questioning why you are here, or what you're doing, what you're not doing, right? You're just doing your business. You're trying to get from point A to trying to get to point B, trying to pay the rent, trying to get the credits, trying to graduate, right? Trying to get the burrito special over at Taco Bell, which is pretty good. It's only $5.29. You get little chips with it too, right? So your stuff is oriented towards the everyday, correct? Contemporary theory begins to question the basis not only of society itself, but of knowledge, meaning how we know what we know, how we can possibly even have thoughts, how we can possibly even have knowledge itself, right? And one of the domains in which you'll see this most clearly is when we get into the conversation about semiotics. Semiotics is language. So contemporary theory even begins to question language itself. And it is directly responsible, or is the antecedent, for many a contemporary political disagreement or political development, however you want to look at it. For instance, what word we use for a big metal disc that covers the sewer system. Is it a manhole or is it a person hole? Well, according to the city of Berkeley, it's a person hole, right? Now, this is, you could say, a much more inclusive way of thinking about it. But the idea is that it matters what word we use, because words themselves are not just a form of knowledge, but they actually constitute reality. That's an idea that comes out of contemporary theory. That's not something that classical theorists would have talked about. Marx wasn't talking about words, right? Marx was talking about revolution, he was talking about steel, he was talking about blood, he was talking about factories, right? Durkheim wasn't talking about words either. Now, he talked about society, this idea of the collective, he talked about religion and magic, but words themselves were never in doubt, right? Consciousness itself was never in doubt. But contemporary theory does do that. And it does that because it goes deep, so to speak. It also goes far in lots of different directions, right? Now, why does it do that? Well, because the 20th century, which is when most contemporary theory unfolds, and really there hasn't been much developed actually since the 20th century, I'm sad to say, is a period of time in which the world is changing quick in so many ways. And one of the ways in which it's transforming rapidly is in terms of how we think about the world, but mostly how we think about ourselves as individuals, as members perhaps of some kind of greater collectivity, nation, state, ethnicity, race, gender, sexuality, right? These other kinds of groupings and categories. And so as those things begin to become destabilized, right, they become fluid, they break apart. And so theory is in many ways generating these fractures, but also sometimes just trying to make sense of all the fracturing that's taking place and going on. So then what does theory do? Well, theory is a tool for seeing. That's it. It's a way of trying to make sense, essentially. It's a lens, right? But at the same time, it also makes us question things, makes us wonder about things. And then it finally, hopefully, if we do it right, and we succeed, it gives us some understanding, although I'm sad to report in contemporary theory, you might end up more confused by the end than when you started. But that's okay. And that's another thing about contemporary theory, right? It will not give you an answer. It will give you multiple perspectives, multiple approaches, multiple lenses, but it expressly rejects the idea of a totality. Okay? It expressly rejects the idea that there's one answer. And you got to be kind of comfortable with that a little bit. Otherwise, it'll just feel cacophonous. It'll feel confusing. It'll feel like it's nonsense. It's not nonsense. It's a lot of sense, too much sense, and that can be confusing. All right, so let's think about theory then a little bit more. All right. One of the important things about theory too is this. I say that a lot of people are sociologists. In fact, most people I've met have been sociologists. Very confident ones at that, especially in bars. You meet a lot of sociologists at bars. You meet people who essentially are very convinced of their particular theoretical take of the world, but they don't usually recognize it as a particular kind of theory, right? They see it as factual on some level. They see it as a entrenched, clear framework for understanding human actions and also the constitution of society in general, right? That is usually what we will call an opinion. It's an opinion because you haven't done the work of understanding, or at least of tracing, right? The myriad, that means that the lots of work that's already been done out there. Empirical work on one level, empiricism means facts, right? The data, the statistics, the research, right? And on the other hand, the theoretical philosophical work that's been done, the traditions that have organized the historical arguments that have already taken place, right? So theory is not that. Theory is not opinion, right? The other thing it's not is ideology, and we're going to talk a lot about that this semester. An ideology is simply the idea of the idea. It is that you have one singular idea, and it is the totality of ways in which you understand all experiences, right? So it is essentially an imposed understanding. And we're going to get a little bit into that today in terms of there's basically a graph and starting out with sciences on one end and ending up over here with philosophy and ideology on the other. Right? So we'll talk about that. Ideology is both simple and kind of complex. Right? All right. Now, there are kind of two fundamental bases to the idea of sociology itself and even to theory itself. One is that it is actually scientific, and the other is that it's rational. Right? Now, what makes it scientific? It makes it scientific in terms of there has to be testable hypotheses on some level. Okay? That is that, again, this is what differentiates it from opinion. If you come up with a theory, that means it's a way of organizing the sensory experience, what we call data, for instance, if you're taking a computer science class. Organizing sensory experience into a coherent whole, right? You then have to make sure that those experiences and the way you organize them are testable on some level. In other words, they have to actually correspond to observable phenomena, what we call reality, right? The other thing is that it has to be rational. Now, this is an interesting idea, the rational, on some level. Because the rational, there we go. So the rational on some level is a kind of a loaded term, right? To be rational, we think of as being good. But what rational really means is that you're thinking about things in a calculated manner, and it is explicitly not irrational. Now, what is irrational? Irrational tends to mean emotional, all right? Now, I'm teaching actually another class right now on emotions. And emotions are not necessarily bad in and of themselves, but historically speaking, they have been the enemy, essentially, of reason, right? That's the hard line. That's the dichotomy, the way it's been constructed, at least in Western philosophy, epistemology, and also in sociology, right? That on one hand, you have emotions, you have feelings, you have the arts, right? You have humanities, you have poetry and painting and music and dance, and which are all great things and are ways of knowing, right? but they're not scientific ways of knowing. The scientific ways of knowing are the rational. Those are based upon reason. Those are going to be processes that explicitly actually reject emotions because emotions are tied to values. Emotions then would cloud your ability to understand things in an objective and neutral manner. And that's why it tries to be rational or reasoned. Right? So that's kind of that's the basis right there. We'll talk about that a little bit more. All right. So you have the basic ideas there. Now let's look at theory itself, and there's multiple ways we can approach this. And again, this might sound confusing, and I'm going to loop back to stuff over and over again. So, if you missed something the first time, don't worry, we'll come back to it. And one way that we can really kind of begin to understand theory in all its complexity is the level that it's working, right? That it's operating on. So there's micro level, there's macro, there's actually mid-level, and then there are grand theories. So macro level means macrological. That means big, right? Big theories. So a macrological theory of society would be one in which we are trying to understand the big stuff, right? We're not interested in necessarily the individual. We're not interested in how you're feeling, what specific decisions you make, right? Instead, we're interested in large scale patterns. So we might be looking at inequality. That's a big macrological. So we would crunch some numbers, we would look at income, we would look at wealth accumulation, perhaps we would compare it generationally or regionally, or we'd look at other significant social categories, right? And then we would come up with some kind of explanation or theory for what's going on. That's macrological. Then there's micrological or micro sociology. Micro sociology is going to look at really small scale stuff, literally like the kind of words you use when you're talking to somebody. This is where ethnography lives, right? So if you go do interviews, and this is, by the way, one of the spaces, if you're wondering, or your parents are yelling at you, like, why are you a sociology major? I'm spending all this money and you're going to be unemployed. Well, you can come back and say, mom, dad, uncle, whoever, I can be a micro sociologist. They're going to be like, what does that mean? You're going to say, well, I can actually go work for corporations and I can do consumer research. This is what microsociology does out in the world if you want a job. And what does that mean? That means you're going to go in to a room. Let's say you're trying to research teenage consumption patterns. You're going to go hang out with a bunch of teenagers somewhere, and you're going to pay attention to the words they use, the clothes they wear, what they like wearing, what they don't like wearing, and what kind of meaning they are ascribing to all these little simple interactions, right? Why did they pick that style of sweatshirt versus the other style of sweatshirt? And you would pay attention to the language that's being used. And you would pay attention to the concepts that are being created. You would pay attention to the ways in which there are various kinds of economies that are being constructed. And not economies of they bought the sweatshirt, but rather economies perhaps within the social group itself. Who's cool and who's not cool. That's an economy, right? That's a form of status. That's microsociology. And the ways in which these things are actually being built and constructed in the process of interaction. Then the last one here is the grand theories. And the grand theories is where we started out in sociology. This is the Durkheim, this is the Weber, this is the Karl Marx, right? When we talk about grand sociology, Karl Marx is a grand sociologist. And grand sociologists are very passé. We don't like them anymore, especially when you get down into later contemporary theories. In fact, postmodern or post-structuralism, which will be towards the end of the semester, expressly rejects the idea of grand theories because they see these things as fundamentally oppressive, right? Why are they fundamentally oppressive? Well, because if you have a grand theory, you are making a particular kind of claim. What's your claim? Your claim is that you can explain everything in the world. That makes you a kind of a god, right? So postmodernism and post-structuralism, which emerged in the 1960s, and some other stuff is happening in the 1960s too, right? What? There's revolutions happening, there's post-colonialism, there's anti-colonialism, there's the feminism movement, there is a civil rights movement, right? There are multiple ways in which the idea of a grand narrative, one especially rooted in a particular tradition of European philosophy and thought, is seen as totalizing and domineering. So grand theories become rejected and passé, right? So you have the scales of theory, okay? Now, you also have what are called paradigms. And this is very interesting. So I think this is, let's pause for a moment and really summarize what's happening here. Contemporary theory is something which is always changing. Contemporary theory is also something which has multiple traditions that coexist simultaneously. That's not usually how knowledge used to work, historically speaking. Historically speaking, before the 20th century, you had some dominant narrative that almost everyone in society knew about and believed, right? This is religion, for instance. So if you read Durkheim, Elementary Forms of Religious Life from classical theory, and you go back in time to some village somewhere, doesn't matter where it is, and you ask people in that village, what's the purpose of life? They're all going to answer the same way, right? They're all going to be like, oh, well, we do this because the sun god tells us to, right? And that's it. There's one theory. They're going to call it a theory. They're just going to call it God, or they're just going to call it reality. In contemporary theory, in the contemporary moment, in the 20th century, there's all of a sudden this realization and this acknowledgement that there's no grand theory anymore. There's not any one story. And all we really are left with is paradigms. A paradigm is a model. That's all it is. It's a model. It is like a little, like a model. You made a little model of a house or something like that. Well, they're models of reality. They're models of the world. This is what we call theory. And these paradigms will shift. They will change. There's a famous book called Paradigm Shifts by this guy named Kuhn, Kuhn. If you want to read them, go ahead. It's really short. It took the world by storm. And essentially what Kuhn argued is that there's no truth. Science itself is not discovering truths. Science actually simply is producing paradigm shifts. That's all, right? So what are paradigms? Paradigms are philosophical and theoretical frameworks, which we use in sociology, but all disciplines use them, right? So it doesn't matter if it's sociology or political science or biochemistry or computer science or physics or astrophysics. Every discipline has paradigms. And there'll be a dominant paradigm. And within those paradigms, you will formulate various types of theories, which are generalizations. And then what will happen is you'll go out and you'll do experiments to support that paradigm, right? So in some ways, paradigms help guide us, but at the same time, paradigms trap us, right? They limit what we can know, what we can't know, because it's outside of our paradigm, right? If something's outside of our paradigm, we don't know about it, we can't think about it. Correct. Time travel, not in our paradigm, right? It's not. It's in science fiction movies, but no one is going to seriously say, hey, we're going to talk about time travel today. It's outside of our paradigm. It may exist, it may not, but it's not in our current paradigms, so we don't talk about it, and we wouldn't talk about it seriously. That's what I mean by paradigms. So there are three big paradigms in sociology to this day. Lots of theories, but there are three really big paradigms, the ones that you can kind of slot all the theories under. So this is helpful for you to try and organize all of this, because we're going to be covering a lot of stuff. So think of these as like three big bags, and you could shove stuff in the bag, right? The first one is structural functionalism. Okay, that's one of the bags. That's one of the paradigms. And that comes out of Durkheim, if you remember Durkheim, right? Functionalism is the idea that society tries to function. That's it. It just preserves itself. It is like an organism. It's like your own body, right? You get hurt, it hurt. You're like, ow, and you try and fix that. Why? Because you don't want to cease existing, correct? You're trying to perpetuate yourself. The argument is that societies are the same way. Societies are organisms, and they have a kind of determinative tendency to try and perpetuate themselves. How do they perpetuate themselves? By making sure that they maintain some form of homeostasis, some form of continuing functionality. And then, how do they do that? Well, they do that through various types of social structures. hence structural functionalism. That's kind of the first big paradigm. The second one is conflict theory. You know this one. This is Karl Marx, right? But there are lots of conflict theories. It's not just Marxism. And conflict theories essentially argue that the big question of society is not how it preserves itself, which is structural functionalism, right? Structural functionalism is like chaos and order. Okay, societies are always in danger of descending into chaos. How do we maintain order? How do we keep people together? How do we keep people working together and engaging with each other in a kind of productive way? Conflict theory, on the other hand, is that societies are actually fundamentally conflictual, and that's actually a good thing, right? That there is a contest always taking place in societies, that there is always going to be, to some degree or another, groups that are struggling over some kind of resource. Resource doesn't always have to be money. It can be status, right? It can be respect, right? It can be geography, it can be almost anything, right? But the point is that there's conflict there. Societies are determined and kind of are created by conflict. And then the last one is symbolic interactions. And symbolic interaction can operate on both levels. It can, they can kind of be structural functionalist. It can also be conflictual. But symbolic interactionism is looking at what it sounds like, interactionism through symbols. This is where we pay attention to language. This is where we pay attention to the construction of culture and norms and ways of being, right? This is the idea that's responsible for the idea of social construction. And you know that one. You've heard that a billion times before. What does actual social construction mean? Well, ultimately what it means is that human beings use symbols to make meaning, right? That's it. That we make stuff up. We make stuff up through language. We make stuff up through gestures. We make stuff up through art. We make stuff up through clothing, right? Material culture as well as symbolic culture. We make reality, right? And that's how we constitute. All right. So here's a nifty little chart for you to use, and you can turn to it, and it gives you this level of analysis. It gives you the paradigm, and then it helps describe the focus as well as the analogies, right? So let's look at it a little bit more closely. We talked about structural functionalism already, and its level of analysis usually tends to be big or middle, right? Right. So it tends to look at bigger things. And the focus of structural functionalism is the way each part of society functions together to contribute to the functioning of the whole, right? So, for instance, what does the university system do for society, right? What is its function? How does it keep the body, we use a metaphor here, what organ is it? How does it keep the body working? Well, immediately we can think about the university is doing what? It's transmitting norms. So when you come to university, you think on one level you're learning skills, which you are. But on another level, what you're being is re-educated, right? We are essentially trying to make sure that whatever type of socialization, that's the word we use in sociology, that happened in your home is going to be compatible with the norms of society so that you are integrated. See that language? It's all about getting things to work together, to mesh in. We don't want you to be a square peg in a round hole in structural functionalism. You have to be rounded, and that's what we're doing at the university, right? We're deburring you. We're cutting off the edges. We're making sure you're not square. Going to make you round for the round hole so that you can become a productive member of society. How do we do that? Well, we acclimate you. We re-socialize you. We do that through various kinds of habits, right? Which eventually become internalized through the process of re-socialization, and you end up thinking it's normal. And it is, because now you are normal. You are now part of the society itself. What kind of society? Well, we're a capitalist society, free market society, based upon essentially work and wages. And so we have to prepare you to be a worker for wages, right? So here you are showing up on time, sitting here, nodding your head, acting as if you're interested, right? While the boss person up front is taking note and then gonna give you a goodie or a baddie review and either get you fired or not, right? That's the idea of structural functionalism, right? So that, and every component of society is doing this on some level. not just the educational system, to everything, right? Because it has to be. Because the whole point is to make sure that we all don't descend into chaos, right? If you all just start developing your own norms and your own values, your own ideas, what ends up happening? We would fragment. This is a question that's common in political science. Well, conflict theory has an interesting take too, because it too can talk about education, and it sees it very differently. It too is a macrological theory. But the conflict theorist would look at education and look at you showing up today, and they would see something very different, right? They wouldn't see a process by which we are all being integrated. They wouldn't see this process as being benign. They wouldn't see it as necessarily being a good thing, right? Instead, they might perceive education as what? As, of course, a form of domination, right? That's the last one. So as you come here to the university, you are indeed being re-socialized. They wouldn't use the word re-socialization. They would use the word ideology. They would say that this is a form of hegemony, which comes from this guy named Gramsci, which we'll talk about as a Marxist. And hegemony is when there is one idea in the society that dominates the society itself and then dominates all individuals in that society. Well, where's that idea come from? The conflict theorist would say. Whose idea is this? Well, conflict theorists would always say that the idea would emanate from the dominant group, right? So that the educational system itself is not about optimizing your individual development. It's not about liberating you. It's not about increasing your consciousness. It's not about increasing the quality of your life. Instead, it's about making sure that you absorb the values that the dominant class wants you to absorb, right? So it is a form of domination itself. So the education then is transmitting dominant culture. That's what it's doing. Dominant culture of what? Well, here you are once again sitting in this classroom. And instead of us engaging in some kind of harmonious collective experience, trying to maintain and build society and prevent conflict, what's really happening? You're competing for grades, the conflict theorist would say, right? I get this question all the time. Do you curve, right? Are you comparing grades between various kinds of students? Well, it depends. If, let's say, I was a conflict theorist, I might say, yes, I am. Because I want you to be alienated from your fellow student. I want you to understand your role in society is not one of harmonious integration, but of ceaseless individuation and competition. Right. That's the conflict. Sorry, I see some nods. There's zero conflict theorists. Yeah, people like conflict. This is Marx, right? Marx 101. Right. And that's one way of understanding it. And then there's the symbolic interactionist. Right? And again, this is micro, though, very different than structural functionalism and conflict theory. For the symbolic interactionist, on the other hand, we're going to look at one-to-one communication. Right? And what does that actually do? For instance, what does it mean to be on X? What does it mean to be on TikTok? What does it mean to talk to someone in a cafe versus talking to someone online? And what does that tell us about individuals and about societies themselves? Well, the question then would be, how do students themselves react to the cultural messages in schools? So symbolic interactionism does something very different than functionalism and conflict theory. Functionalism is very interested in making sure we don't all kill each other, right? This is Hobbes, right? This is Leviathan. This is the question of social order, right? Human beings are scary people on some level to the structural functionalists and political scientists. Because at any moment, right, we could all just descend into chaos, and that terrifies us. And the conflict theorists, on the other hand, are like, no, we should descend into chaos, right? Because we're not friends. That's the conflict theorist. Social functionalists are like, we are friends. We're friends. Yes, we're friends. It's trying to keep us together. Conflict theory, in many ways, is trying to break us apart because, of course, conflict theorists argue that there's a sunny horizon beyond the conflict itself, right? Symbolic interactionists don't have either of those assumptions. They don't think that society tends to break apart, and they don't think that the revolution will exactly be a wonderful thing either. They don't even think necessarily the revolution can happen or can't happen. They're not interested in that. If it did happen, they would be interested in how people talked about it, right? What was it that generated this revolution? Why did people feel revolutionary all of a sudden? What did they say? What kind of words did they use? What kind of meaning were they constructing over this period of time? All right. So you get the general idea of those three kinds of big theories. Now I want to say, all of you are already using theory to a great degree, right? And you already have lots of assumptions. Now you're sociologists already, you've taken some classes, so you're beyond the stage of opinion, I would say. You are practitioners, right? And so let's do a little practice right now. Let's think about a simple question. Let's think about the question of education. You're all here, I think, yes? Yes, you're all here, right? Why are you here? I assume on some level, aside from the true philosophers amongst you, which is maybe one or two, that you're here because you believe in this statement. Education is the key to social mobility, yes? What do you think? Who agrees? Education is the key to social mobility. Yeah? Very few. Okay. All right, the rest of you, what are you believing? See, you thought by raising your hand you were getting out of it. No, now I'm gonna ask you questions. So, if it's not the key to social mobility, what's education for? Yes? You gotta speak loud though, it's a big room.
Sorry, okay. So, the reason why I'm here is I've already been in the workforce for 3 years, I already have my career, and I can still see every single day. I want to try
Ah,
my experience, my knowledge, it's not that.
ah,
Not that I agree that it is the key. I think there are other ways.
yeah. Right. So knowledge is not the key for you. So the word education to you means something different. Well, I guess we should define that. What does education mean? And for you, you said a credential. Yes? A piece of paper. Yes, and that is one of the theories actually out there, right? And we'll talk about that. It's called the credential society, literally. And the idea is that education itself is no longer focused on the development, the humanistic project of you being developed in your full potentiality, right? That inside of you there is a poet, or there is a great physicist, or there is a great surgeon. That's not the point of education anymore. The point of education, as you said, is simply a credential, and the credential is, as you said, holding you back, right? So, what theory would that fall under?
I would say the credential, which is the piece of paper that I kind of point at, is the symbolism.
Yeah.
Symbolic interactionism.
Yes.
Conflict theory would be who determines who actually knows something and can actually move within that social system. And then the symbolic interactionism is just like how I fit into that whole piece of life.
Yes. And you can have multiple theories operating at the same time. That's perfect, right? Yes. Conflict theory, because you're being held back. There is a structure outside of society that is limiting your mobility, right? It's limiting your social mobility. The credentialing is right. It is the symbolic representation that is communicated to other people in the society that you have pushed the right buttons, you jumped through the right hoops, right? And on some level, we could think of the piece of paper as not just a piece of paper, actually. Because as you work your way through the university here at Berkeley, by the end of it, you will be a different person. You will have been re-socialized. You will have acquired different forms of cultural capital. It comes from this guy named Bourdieu. We'll take a look at him later on, too. The way you speak will have changed. The way you walk, the way you talk, what you like to eat, right? You will be a fundamentally different person than you would have been if you had not gone to university. Yeah. So yeah, that's it. This is the ways in which we use theory. That's it. And there's multiple ways in which we could understand the very simple assertion that education, right, is, for instance, the key to social mobility. It is on some level. It is, absolutely. And in other ways, it's not. But why do theory? Okay, you understand stuff. Good for you, right? Now you're just that annoying person at the bar, right? No, that's not it. if you understand things, we like to think, at least this is one of the premises of the modern world and scientific theory, if you can understand something, you can change it, right? So it's a form of control. It's a form of power, right? If you simply accept theories unreflexively, that means you accept certain ideas about society itself, what you're actually doing is you're accepting the status quo. It means you're saying, fine, it just is what it is. I'm not going to change it. So theories are ways to change societies and also ways to change yourself within the society, right? It's ways in which you can resituate yourself. You can understand yourself differently in the society, but also you can understand the society itself differently, right? Yeah. Yeah. Yes, absolutely.
So, like, theorizing it's just accepting it is just like, it's, I'm here in class, the A, 100% is the only thing that's gonna determine that I actually know what you're talking about. But in reality, if you're just like, well, what does that A actually mean? Does it mean that you know how to follow the bureaucracy and follow the rules to get that A, or does that actually mean that you know what you actually need to know to what's the purpose of the course? What was the reason? That's what I'm thinking.
Yeah.
Because for me, my meaning of meaning, like, I can get it anywhere. It just means something in the society. That's why I'm doing it. Others need to have the paper to
Yeah.
does that make sense?
Makes perfect sense. She's not a plant, by the way. I didn't, but, yeah, no, absolutely. It makes perfect sense. But, and here this is, the Marxist kind of conflict theory perspective is always, I think, really appealing. Absolutely was for me, certainly, for a very long time. But then I begin to wonder on some level, right? I mean, you say, because it can take on kind of almost a pessimistic tone, and it can be a little bit reductive, right? Because if you were all just here because the man made us come here, right? Including me, I'm here for a wage, right? Then what? What happens? Then we're all just kind of the victims of a social structure. And this is going to be the next part of what we're going to talk about. Because there's agency and there's a structure. Agency, you are an agent. You have free will. You have autonomy, right? If we are just simply being acted upon, right, by the material conditions of our existence, then you cease actually having any freedom in that circumstance. Whether you think you have it or not, you're saying, well, I chose to come here, I want this credential. It's like, but did you? Actually, if things are so structured, there's a thing called structural Marxism, and this is what you're kind of talking about. If things are so structured, if society is structured in such a way that you've been essentially funneled like a little bead of water into the current path that you're existing in, then you actually don't have any agency, you don't have any autonomy, you don't have any individual free will. And so this is going to be one of the big questions, actually, as we look through all these theories and we move through these theories. So the question of individual freedom or agency versus social structure itself, right? And there's a tension there. There's a real tension there. So I thank you. That's a great example of conflict theory, and it brings to bear one of the fundamental kind of questions of theory that we're going to be looking at over the course of the semester, is to what degree can you have kind of autonomy and agency? And that's a whole tradition too, by the way. So you could say, you think of it this way, I'm kind of jumping ahead a little bit here, but left revolutionary theories tend to be heavily structural, okay? In other words, the world itself is built already, and it exists, and there's nothing you can do about it, and you can scream and you can try and fight, and really the only thing you could probably do that might save you is you can destroy that world. That's revolutionary left kind of sociological thinking, right? And that these structures that exist are always to your detriment, right? They're always hurting you on some level. If you go all the way to the other side of sociological theory, and these are usually highly individualistic theories, they tend to be more micrological, we would call them conservative theories. Conservative theories go on the other end, go kind of on the other end of this kind of spectrum, and they think, no, what you are is pure freedom, right? You are pure autonomy. You make decisions to come here. You made a decision to pursue a degree in sociology. You are free, right? The prison is your own imagination. The prison is that you believe that these external forces have so much power and control over you. They don't, right? You have power and control over yourself. And one is highly individual and one is highly collectivistic, right? Now, people, and this gets, we can have, the whole semester is going to be about this, so we don't have to have that fight right now. But it will be a fight, right? Certainly, between those who are structural and structural Marxists, and you don't have to be a Marxist to be a structuralist. There are other kinds, and also you don't have to be a capitalist to be an individualist either, right? An autonomy of the individual can have other kinds of connotations. So there are different ways you can kind of scramble these eggs and kind of organize it differently. So, but there's a scale and a perspective there. I'm going to get to that. All right, so let's finish this part off though real quick. So how to do theory, kind of good examples right there. But it has to be systematic and it has to be explanatory. So when we do theories, I'm usually gonna present it to you as a person. It's not a person, doesn't matter who they are actually. I mean, the biography matters a little bit, we'll talk about that too. But really the names are placeholders, so if I say Marx, we're really talking about historical materialism and conflict theory. If I say Foucault, we're really going to be talking about post-structuralism, right? If I say bell hooks, we're going to be talking about black feminism. If I say, these are placeholders for theories, which then are folded under particular kinds of paradigms. And we have to look at how these theories are built, because they are built like a building, and they also are related to other theories, and how they're related to those other theories become important too, because they're drawing upon already existing bodies of knowledge and they're making particular kinds of arguments, right? And then we have to pay attention to the ways in which these theories explain how and why things happen, right? Now there's another key point here, and this is a priori. This is a fancy word out of philosophy. So you should know this word actually. A priori, there's a posteriori, a priori. A priori means before experience, right? That's what it means, it's Latin. And what that means is that we all come to the world with a priori knowledge. In other words, we have assumptions. So does sociology, so do paradigms, so do various kinds of theories, right? What are these assumptions? These assumptions we call tradition. That's it. That's what a tradition is. People say tradition, that just means assumptions. That just means stuff that you just have and it's already been there, okay? Society is composed of traditions. And these are just how things were done, right? Science has traditions. It's a tradition, right? Theory itself also has traditions, various types of theoretical perspectives. And that last dot that has nothing, that has no traditions. I don't know why it's there. All right. All right. So just checking if you were listening. So this is the money graph right here. This is going to help us kind of organize all of this. Okay. Looks kind of complicated right now. You're like, what the hell is this? It'll make sense to you eventually. But you can think about theories and this is from the article, the Alexander article on what is theory, by the way. So, if you look at that, you can just read the highlighted parts in that article. You don't have to read the whole thing. It's kind of long-winded. But there's some key points he's making. And one of the key points he's making is that if you look at sociological theory, one of the ways you could organize it is by its level of observation, meaning from facts to theory, from science to philosophy, okay? Usually, not always, but usually if you're on the science fact side of things, you're going to tend to be much more individualistic and what we would call conservative, right? And by the way, when I use that term conservative, I'm not talking about it in the political sense. I'm not talking about it in terms of like Republicans and Democrats. I'm talking about it in terms of sociology and in terms of philosophy and in terms of various theoretical traditions. Conservation means literally what it sounds like. You keep traditions. That's all. That's all it means. And if you go to the other side, theories, when you go pure theory, those tend to be what we call revolutionary, right? They want to change societies because they see society as it exists as somewhat problematic. All right. All right. Well, we kind of ran out of time there. So we'll stop at this graph. Be sure to read Gramsci for next class. That's the third reading in the bunch, because we're going to talk a little bit about ideology and intellectuals and the role of the intellectual next class. Okay? All right. Yeah. 3:30? All right, wait, don't go anywhere. Woo! You just say it. You know, you're getting a lot of hate right now. All right, sorry, my bad. Oh, I think it was 3. Oh, because the 3-day-a-week one. Sorry, my bad. All right, good, good. Don't blame her. Don't blame her. She's a good person. Blame me. Blame me. You got your hopes up? No, I crushed them. All right. All right, well, I'll end early anyway today, but let me just do the 50 more minutes on this one real quick. All right. All right, so good. This is good. All right, so to the left, you're going to have much more philosophical, kind of metaphysical understandings of society, right? And so these are going to be theories, and Marx is a classic example. Now, Marx spends a lot of time and spills a lot of ink talking about factories and capital, and he writes 23 volumes of Capital, and he looks at sort of the way that, you know, cloth is made in Manchester in the 1800s, et cetera, et cetera. But at the end of the day, he's trying to create essentially a cover for what is his basic supposition, right? And what is his basic supposition? His basic supposition is rooted in the Enlightenment concept of the rational individual who is ultimately and always equal to all other individuals, right? And that individual itself is full of potential. And any circumstances under which that individual is not manifesting their full potential is a deformation, right? Something bad is happening to them. That's his fundamental assumption. So it's ideological, and it has a basic kind of assumption of value, which then is being essentially imposed onto the society itself. Empirical studies, on the other hand, will start out from what they observe on the ground, and then they will surmise and build theories up and around the data or the empirical facts they kind of create and construct. Now, Alexander argues, Alexander is the author of the article. He says that if you look at sociological theory, you can usually see, not always, but you can usually see a pretty clear pattern. Facts tend to orient themselves towards a much more kind of conservative sociology. Heavily theory will tend to orient itself towards a much more revolutionary leftist kind of theory. And the mixed stuff usually tends to be what we would call liberal, right? Now, what does liberal mean in this context of sociology? Well, liberal usually talk about consensus, right? They usually talk about the ways in which societies can build consensus through negotiation, right? This is kind of a democratic process. The theorist that talks about that allows this guy named Habermas, which we'll talk about him a little bit later on. All right, so now we have that order of science, right? You have facts on one hand, pure theory on the other. Science versus philosophy, and that will tend to produce two different kinds of sociology. Now you have another big one. This is the question of order and action, and this is what you were talking about, and you were talking about the educational system. So, order is what structures the society itself and what makes it predictable. So order asks, what accounts for the patterns or predictability of behavior that lead us to experience social life as routine? So in other words, when we walk about our lives every day, right, we tend to expect things to go a certain kind of way. If you walk up to a Starbucks and you go in there, you expect that experience to happen in a particular kind of way, right? When you drive up to McDonald's and that window opens, there's a script There's an order. There's a thing that's going to happen there. You go to a doctor's office. There's a thing that's going to happen, which you expect to happen. You come to this class. You expect the professor to go the full time and not space out and try and let you go a half hour early, right? That's order. That's the way you expect things to go, right? Well, the question is how? How does that work? How does it happen? It always blows my mind, and I guess you can understand why, because I seem to have a problem with structure. When I show up to classes and all of a sudden there's people here. All right, I'm just like, what? How'd you get here? There's massive coordination of lots of different people. It's mystifying to me on some level. I mean, I can understand it intellectually, but I don't understand it in a deep kind of emotional sense. Because it's also not just the simple coordination, but it's also the process of all of the factors in your existence that operated on you and in you and through you that put you in this chair today. If you think about it, it's incredible, right? It's incredible. What are the factors that led up to this moment? That you being here today, Berkeley, sitting in that seat, taking this class. That's order. That's the structure outside of you. Those are the predictable behaviors and the patterns of experience that we just take for granted. Going to school every day, right? When you were a kid, right? You just did it. I did it sometimes. As I got older, I did it less often. That's a whole other story. So yeah, these patterns, right? And then there's action. This is the question of what motivates you as an individual, right? So there's the pattern, there's the university, there's a class, it meets at 2 o'clock, people show up, they don't show up. But then some of the students didn't show up today. And some of you did, right? Why? Why'd you come? Money, fame, shame, boredom? What was your individual motivation to show up today? So this tension between these two forces, between your own, I hesitate to use the word psychological, but I'm going to use it because I think it makes it maybe more familiar to you. But the agency question is almost a psychological one, but it's not psychological. It's not just in your head. It's the individual motivation. It's the thing that compels you to do something or not do something, right? What we would call will in philosophy. And then the structures outside of you. And sociology is really interested in this binary, right? Agency versus structure. And this is not the traditional philosophical question of, is there free will? It's not that. It's more operationalized than that. Because it's individual versus collective, but it's the self versus society, right? It's the self versus society. So one of the common threads that go all the way back to classical theory, and here now we can tie classical theory into contemporary theory. In classical theory, this is almost the primary question, right? So if we think about Durkheim for a second and suicide, remember that one? Right, Durkheim and suicide. What did Durkheim say about suicide? Well, Durkheim was talking about anomie. He was talking about the individual in society. And what Durkheim argued in suicide was that if an individual is not integrated into the society sufficiently, they can suffer from anomie. Anomie is a state of normlessness. That means that you don't feel grounded, right? You don't feel connected, not just to other people, but actually to existence itself, because you don't have enough of a social structure that has become internalized in you, right? It means you sleep too late. It means you're not eating 3 meals a day. It means you're playing Overwatch too much, right? You've kind of lost your bearing on society and existence. You've descended too much into the self. You do whatever you want, whenever you want. And that can create a state in which you don't have norms that correspond to the norms of society. You are normless. You suffer from anomie. And he argued that led to all sorts of bad things, right? And this is something that we see in contemporary society as well. But what happens when a society imposes too much structure on an individual? Well, this is then the case in which we have a clear form of kind of oppression and domination. And this is where Marx comes in. So Durkheim warns us, hey, you don't want to be too individual. You don't want to be too free. You want society inside of you. It actually saves you. It protects you. It's a kind of, it's a vaccine, essentially, against the worst tendencies that can emerge. But if you have too much society, and now here we go to Marx, something else can happen. You can become deformed, he says. You can be alienated, right? Alienated from your labor, alienated from yourself, alienated from other individuals, because you've simply become a worker within the society, and the society itself, as it's oriented towards profit in a capitalist society, this then demeans and dehumanizes the individual and places you solidly within the structure, and the individual itself is lost, right? Because the individual should always be concerned with developing the self. So this is the conflict that begins to emerge. Now let's look a little bit more closely at order and structure. So in social theory, in contemporary social theory, as well as classical, society is thus pictured as an overarching system that works down on individuals and groups to determine and shape the social order, right? So you are expected to go to college. You have to get that college degree, right? You got to get a good credit score, right? You have to do all of these things. Essentially, you are being imposed upon by this externalized force, which is everywhere and nowhere, right? That's the other thing about social structures. You could see it kind of here and there. It can be institutionalized. It's manifest as this university, for instance. But is it? I mean, these are just people following bureaucratic protocols and various kinds of traditions. There are no people twisting their little mustaches in back rooms plotting your misery, right? That's not how social structure works. It's something which is distributed as social order. And social order is constituted by various kinds of individuals operating through habit, through tradition. So society then is really understood as a kind of a sui generis. That comes from Durkheim, if you recall. And sui generis is this idea that things just simply appear, right? Society wasn't invented, right? It's not like somebody made it one day. They were like, I declare today is society. And then everybody was like, yay, there's society, right? No, it emerges. It just appears when you have enough people doing enough things over time. It just kind of happens. That's what sui generis means, right? And when it happens according to its own logic, which is distinct from the individuals themselves. So for instance, a mob is a good example of the sui generis. Anybody ever been in a mob before? No? Oh, you have? All right, good. Me too. It was a concert. It was a long time ago. It was Red Hot Chili Peppers. I was pretty young. And I decided to jump into the mosh pit. I quickly got punched in the eye. I lost my shoe. I almost died. I barely escaped my life. And that was the last time I was ever in a mosh pit or a concert at all. Because at that moment, I felt the power, the sui generis nature of a mob, right? What was your experience like with the mob? Okay. Oh, okay. Well, you like chaos then. Okay, good. So you're not into order. Yeah. Yeah, so that's an example. And there's other kinds of mobs. It takes on a life of its own, right? No one is directing it. No one is controlling it, right? And if you were to say stop, and nobody's listening to you, right? It is composed of all of these individuals, but it supersedes all the individuals. It's like a car. If you take a car apart, can you drive it anywhere? No. But if you put the car together, all of a sudden, it can propel you down the highway at 100 miles an hour, right? The totality of the parts is greater than the sum of that totality, right? You put all the parts of the car together, it all of a sudden has an ability that it doesn't have in its little components. And that's the same thing is true of society or a mosh pit, right? The individuals by themselves don't make society. But when you get them all together, now all of a sudden you have society. Same thing with a mob, right? A mob, at some point, we don't know. Scientists, by the way, political scientists are trying to calculate this mathematically. They haven't figured out. What number of people make a mob? Is it 12? Is it 20? Is it 30? We don't know, right? We don't have an exact formula for that because it's not something you can necessarily quantify because it is this sui generis nature. It is this almost magical force that kind of emerges through the connection of individuals. All right. So now this order and this structure, when we become really interested in it, sociologically speaking, this is what we call the macrological, so what we call holistic understanding of society, structuralist, and we're going to use the word collectivist, right? Collectivist. Now, what does collectivist sociology look like? Usually it's going to focus on things like social class, gender, race, right? We're going to look at bigger things in society, not just these things, but bigger things in society. And the classical origins of that are, yes, Durkheim and Marx that we talked about. Now, in contemporary sociology, most collectivists argue that the structures control the self, even at a psycho-emotional level. This is where it gets really interesting. So we're going to look at a group of thinkers called the Frankfurt School at one point, Frankfurt School. And they're Marxists. But they're Marxists who are writing in the 1960s. Durkheim, Adorno. They wrote books like The Culture Industry, for instance. And The Culture Industry is a really interesting book. And it talks about essentially Hollywood. Now, you could update that and just use social media or, whatever, media in general. But their argument was this, that in the 1960s, they observed an interesting phenomenon. They had experienced World War II. They had experienced kind of the rise of fascism, but also the rise of communism before fascism in the 1930s and 1920s. They were pretty old. And they argued that in the United States, what they were seeing was something fascinating and altogether new, which was that a capitalist society like that of the United States was able to maintain itself not through direct violent oppression, as, for instance, fascism had in Europe or communism had in the Soviet Union. Capitalism, on the other hand, was able to function in the United States through a much more subtle mechanism. And what was that subtle mechanism? It was the psychological forces that were operating through culture in its industrialized form that were essentially indoctrinating individuals into a particular kind of logic and way of being. This is why they call it the culture industry. What do they mean by that? Well, they were talking about Hollywood. They were talking about movies, but just mass media in general. And their argument was that capitalism had worked its way into culture, and that culture was the means by which capitalism disseminated its norms and values. And that you as an individual in society were essentially being enculturated, that you were being impregnated, to use, I'm sorry if I use that kind of language, but that this idea was being put into you from the media, essentially, from the Hollywood and various types of other social, cultural forms that was then convincing you to think and believe in certain kinds of ways. So in the culture industry, for instance, the idea specifically was that your desires, and here they tied Freud into all of this, your desires, which were Freudian in nature, your desire for happiness, your desire for love, your death instinct, and your death drive, were all being essentially linked or sutured to your consumption patterns. So that when you had a deep desire inside of you, rather than you going out and pursuing that as some kind of life force, for instance, you want to be an artist or whatever, instead of going out and being an artist, instead you would go and you would watch a movie about it, right? You would go and you would consume stories, you would consume culture, you would consume commodities, which would temporarily quench your deep-seated inner psycho desires, right, for being in existence. So, for instance, when you're feeling sad, you're feeling lonely, right? They would say that you would go down and you would go shopping. And you would listen to the music pumping in the store, and you'd try on a few outfits, and you would see lots of nice, pretty pictures on walls of people whom we think we should look like, wearing the particular kind of commodities, and you would happily surrender over your hard-earned wages to buy this commodity and walk out and feel temporarily satiated, right? But of course, this cycle is endless because it has to be endless under capitalism. If you cease consuming, the Frankfurt School argued, then capitalism would cease accumulating profits. So your lack, essentially, and this comes from Freud, right? Your deep-seated lack, which is actually tied to your subconscious understanding of your own mortality, right? They would say they tapped into this lack through commodities, through the form of consumption, through you buying stuff, which would temporarily assuage or pacify what is this kind of deep-seated understanding of the existential limitations of your own existence, right? That's the Frankfurt School. So this is the psycho-emotional level, right? The collectivist. So that everything that you're doing in this world, not just getting this college degree, you're saying this credential is annoying you. Well, the Frankfurt School would argue that all of your choices are being dictated on some level by a kind of capitalist logic, right? That it's not just going to college. It's literally what you ate this morning, what kind of clothes you wear, who your friends are, how you even see yourself, right? When you look in the mirror is not reality, the Frankfurt School would argue. It's something which is being determined by the external structures of society. And these external structures of society are themselves the capitalist logic of profit and production, right? So that's a collectivist kind of understanding. It's totalizing, right? There's no escape from it. It's everywhere. It's out there. It's above you. And it is impinging upon your existence, not just in material, but also in psychological and even emotional forms. So even your feelings become subject to this. There's a new book that just came out called Limbic Capitalism. You guys heard about this one? No? So the idea is that when you're constantly scrolling on your phones, which you're doing every day, we all are, right? What's happening? Well, it's actually tying, they're arguing into your limbic system, into your literally your biological system, so that it becomes an addictive process. So you are literally, when they say you're phone addicted, it is literally you are biochemically addicted, right? And that the algorithms that are programmed into whether it's TikTok or Call of Duty or Overwatch or video games or whatever, that they're literally designed to ensure that your biochemical processes are constantly being manipulated in such a way as to reinforce the behavior. It's true. I actually met this guy at a party, and he works for one of the big gaming companies. And I was like, "Oh, what do you do?" And he was like, "Oh, no, I'm just a statistician." And I was like, "Oh, that's interesting. What kind of stats do you do?" He's like, "Well, I just look at users and like whether users increase or decrease with various types of patches we make to the game." And I was like, "Oh, how's that going?" He's like, "Oh, it's really interesting. We just made these patches and the user numbers just skyrocketed." I was like, "Oh, so you're like pushing addiction?" He's like, No, we're not pushing addiction." He was like, he's like, No, we just look if there's more engagement. And if there is, then we know it was good. Right. You guys got it. He didn't though. He's making like 300,000 a year. So I don't know. So maybe you shouldn't get it. Just do it. Right. That's limbic capitalism, the argument goes. The argument is that it literally has become tied to your limbic system, to your biochemical processes within your brain and within your body. The Frankfurt School didn't have that kind of data yet, so they just simply related it to psychoanalysis and Freud, and they tied it to this, various types of Freudian concepts of lack, for instance, right? So, according to Freud, we all have a deep kind of lack, which we're always trying to fill. This is, partially why we have certain kinds of sex drives, et cetera, et cetera. And he's saying what replaces all of that under modern capitalism is consumption, right? So that's it. All right. You get that idea then. So the outside pushing down the end. Well, let's turn now to action and to agency. So individuals and groups create, recreate, or alter the social order that works up to produce society. This sounds a lot nicer to me. I don't know. But basically the idea is that you make society, right? There's not some kind of, outside external hegemonic force which is kind of manipulating you. Although, I can see the appeal of that kind of an understanding, right? Because it liberates you on some level in terms of it alleviates any kind of real responsibility. You can be like, it's not my fault, right? It's capitalism. Whereas individual type perspectives say that we are producing the society. It is you and I that make the society. So we are constructing everything. So in this way, that guy I was talking to at the party is innocent in some ways, right? He's saying it's not us manipulating the consumer, it's the consumer manipulating themselves, right? They're the ones who are engaging in this behavior. Log off, he would say. Delete the app, right? Throw the PS4, PS5 out the window, right? You don't have to do it, but you do it. You're the one who is producing society. Society is not producing you. You are the one, through your actions, who are constantly constituting what is the social order. Okay? This kind of a system, whatever they may be, grants a lot more autonomy to actors, okay, to you. You are free, relatively speaking, right? And you can either reproduce patterns or choose to not reproduce patterns. You can reproduce social life as it exists, or you can not reproduce social life as it exists. You can maintain the social order, or you can transform the social order. And you don't have to do it by burning anything down. You can do it by making different kinds of choices. You can do it by behaving differently. You can do it by making different kinds of consumer choices even, right? And this is usually called micro or elementarism, right? It's usually very subjectivist, right? So this is where, here we're going to wander outside of sociology for a moment to make it a little bit more concrete. It's where a lot of the self-help kind of concepts come from, right? This idea that you can transform your own existence through making different kinds of choices. For instance, positive thinking. We come across these kinds of school of thought and psychodynamic theories. Basically, the idea is that if you think positive thoughts, then you can actually transform your actual material existence, right? You can change your own life and actually the world around you through your attitude. Because by changing your attitude, you're going to make different kinds of choices, different kinds of habits, and that will constitute a different kind of existence for you and then for other people around you, right? So, and this is highly individualist. So, all right. So here we go. Individualist theories: the self, the actor, and identity. So identity theories are going to be very big, and we'll see that later on. Beginning in the 1960s and the 1970s, they become one of the primary schools of sociological thought for good reason, right? There are whole classes of people who are ignored, and this is when they finally are part of the sociological discourse and enter the sociological canon. But the individualist theories have specific kinds of traditions. Adam Smith is a big one, of course. We don't think of him as a sociologist, but I do, because he was a moral philosopher. Usually, most people think of him as being the granddaddy of capitalism. It's not. He's a moral philosopher. He actually argues against poverty, and he defines poverty as relative, so relative deprivation. Max Weber, right? Freud, and this guy named Simmel. And then we have modern versions, this guy named Mead, Homans. We won't talk about Homans, really. Maybe we will. Blummer, Goffman, Garfinkel, and Bourdieu. Goffman and Garfinkel are symbolic interactionists. We'll talk a lot about them. And then Bourdieu is, oddly enough, he's kind of a Marxist, but methodologically, he's a microsociologist, right? So all these theories, anyway, tend to emphasize individuals, and not just individuals, but the rational moral autonomy of the individual, right? You are free. And it is because of your moral and rational autonomy that society is what it is. And you are what determines it. All right. So let's look, here's another chart here to make it clear. Individual patterns of social life emerging from interactions. We build society. Collectivist, on the other hand. Patterns of social life seen as the product of existing social structures and arrangements, okay? So those are kind of the big kind of two patterns that we see, as well as different scales of activity, all right? Now there's another element here. So I'm gonna add on another element. I'll do this again next class, don't worry. There's the non-rational and the rational. So non-rational are the things that you don't really think about. They're not reasoned out. Values, morals, norms, traditions, unconscious desires, if we're doing psychoanalysis, Freud, etc., or emotional states, right? And emotions actually play part in later on in sociology with people like Hochschild. And then there's rational. Rational is when you're trying to maximize rewards. So rational means that you are thinking of things in terms of efficiency and the ways in which you can maximize your own benefits. It's actually an economic concept, or at least it becomes one. So you have on one level non-rational and rational, tradition and emotion, whereas on the bottom it's calculation and efficiency. Okay, and that's how we all make decisions, more or less, right? You might do something just because that's how you did it. Right? You might ask someone, oh, let's go do something. You're like, oh, I can't do that. Why? I don't know. It's just I don't do that. That's non-rational. And so then we can think of all sociology as being on this kind of this axis right here, right? And we could place theorists within this grid. So I'm going to use this grid throughout the semester to help us kind of situate theorists and theories, to give you kind of a, so you have a grab bag, you have paradigms. We're going to have the 3 big theories. Those are the bags. And then we're going to have the chart, right, for the individual theorists themselves. Because there's a lot of them and it can get confusing, and this is going to be a way in which we can organize them over the course of the semester, all right? And now it's 3:30. Okay. Hey, what's up, man? How you doing? Back? Another round? Yeah, all right.
I'm gonna miss Thursday's class. I gotta discuss sociological structural functionalism endeavors in Mexico.
And next,
Baptizing the child.
oh, baptizing the child, okay.
Directly like that.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, well, that's a tradition.
But I'm sorry about that. But
No,
I think
it's
I'm
okay.
doing good.
All right, yeah. Good to see you too. Take care. Hey, how's it going?
Fun to
Welcome
come back
back.
face and say hi.
Yeah, good to see you again. Take care.